that's something that's going to get covered for you. All right, that sounds good to me. So, like I said, I sent you the documentation. It is documentation at this point. So when you look through it, basically what you're going to be seeing is the project that I originally did when I decided I wanted to make a period appropriate North Shield. It's going to go through all of my methods, how I did it, why I did it, how we tested it, and kind of what my plans were for further work. I have done further work since then and tested out a few more different methodologies. What I'm going to start with for you guys is just explaining the basics of what makes Viking period North Shield, what we can say definitively about how it was put together, what the best and most prevailing archaeological theories are about how it was put together, for the little things that haven't survived that are missing. And we're going to talk a little bit over how we can recreate that in a modern period, test that out and what we understand from it. So, Viking shields, we have a lot of problems as far as what are considered Viking shields, because there are a couple of different things. The Gula thing, the Frosta thing, the Gragas laws. These are things that have come to us post-Viking period, generally from Iceland, but sometimes from other Scandinavian countries, where basically certain laws have been written down, certain things have been written in the Poetic Edda, the sagas, that kind of thing. And these are, we have to remember, a few hundred years after what we consider the solid end of the Viking period. And they come through and they say, okay, well, when you're making a shield, this is how you have to make it. Specifically in the Gragas laws and the Gula thing and Frosta thing, they say, okay, you're going to use boards from this type of tree. You are going to do one layer one direction, one layer another direction. This is how you're going to cover all of that stuff. And so for a very long time, there was, especially in the context of reenactment, kind of an understanding that this is how Viking shields were constructed. When we look at the actual archaeological evidence, that's not how they were done at all. And we are lucky that we have archaeological evidence that covers shields that appear to have been made for use in battle, as well as shields that appear to have been made as just a decorative shield. And we're able to see what the similarities are in construction, and even to see little bits and pieces of what might have been damaged that's been repaired so that we can see the shield has been used. In period, the Viking shields were very different from the majority of other shields that were being made, which is part of what I found so interesting about them. So at the point in time where the Vikings were, going Viking, where they were raiding, where they were starting to settle other areas, the vast majority of shields were being made out of one big solid board, usually of hardwood. They would do things like, they might be putting it on a frame and getting that gentle curve to the front of it by steaming it on the frame. But usually it was just, one big solid board. It might be covered with leather, it might be covered with fabric, certainly painted, but big, heavy-duty shields. That was pretty much the norm throughout the Viking period for almost everywhere else. Not everywhere, but almost everywhere else. The Viking shields, by comparison, were incredibly thin, incredibly light, and they were made out of really soft, light wood. So while you're having other peoples at that time making their shields out of oak, out of, pretty much any of the solid hardwood woods that you think of, the kind of things that you're using when you're smoking meat, that you want those really dense fibers in the wood. The Vikings were using things like birch and pine. And when you think about pine wood, you go buy some pine from Home Depot when you're, putting up some edging in your room. It's really light, it's really thin and flexible. You can basically just stick your thumbnail in that and gouge a big line all the way down it. So you can see this is already really different from the prevailing shields of the period. when you go on from there, instead of having one big board, what they're doing is they're basically getting a whole bunch of boards about this thick and sticking those together and then covering it up and then using that as their shield. So you end up with a shield that is really, really light and feels, honestly, it feels really flimsy, especially in the SCA context. You know, we're used to, a lot of the time we're making shields out of, you know, plywood, things like that. These Viking shields, they feel really flimsy. And when I was reading about the construction and what they were made from and just how thin they were, that's what made me want to find out more and find out if there was a particular reason they were doing their shields this way. So before I get into the how-to of the construction, and before I get into the ways everything was constructed and why I think it was constructed that way, does anyone have any questions so far? Everyone good? Okay. So the first thing I'm going to point out, when you think about your average SCA shield, I mean, I know a lot of people that they're making their shield using like 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch plywood. Now, those are certainly some of the bigger, heavier ones, but most of the people I know, they're using at least 1/4 inch plywood when they're making an SCA shield, whether or not they're doing, you know, hose pipe around the edges or any of that stuff. Viking shields were about a maximum of 5 millimeters at the center, and the edges were chamfered down, basically shaved down to about 3 millimeters at the edge. Now, if you can imagine birchwood that is no more than 5 millimeters thick, that's the maximum thickness of your wood in a Viking shield. So, to give you an example, here's a Viking shield that I made to test out. I'm going to bring this close up to the camera so you can see this is my thumb next to the wood, okay? That wood is 10 millimeters thick. That's the one board that I left in there at an excessive thickness to see how differently it behaved to the other wood. And what we found was that that one board that was twice as thick as any other point in the shield broke a lot more easily than the rest of it. It just didn't seem to flex quite as much. The other thing we're looking at with the Viking shields is that they are all these boards put together. We don't know for sure because it hasn't survived in the archaeological record. We don't know whether or not they glued them together or whether or not they just placed them together. And then after you'd got that handle attached, after you'd got your edging attached, your fabric covering attached, at that point, that's what pulled it all together. So there's a few different theories. The prevailing theory from archaeologists and people who do the archaeological experimentation like I do, the prevailing theory is you start with your wood, you get all of your boards, and you just glue them together. Just set them down on the ground, probably put your glue in there, squeeze them together, maybe put a heavy brick or something at each edge to keep those boards together. Once that's done, there is some kind of covering that takes place. Again, we don't know 100% because these things don't survive in the soil as well. From the little tiny covering fragments we have in the various different graves, it seems to be that they would be covered either with linen fabric or with leather. And our best guess is that basically what they were doing is they were taking hide glue or hoof glue, which you don't get it in a bottle that you can use on its own. You basically have to boil it for it to be usable. And it seems most likely from the archaeological finds that we have, the traces on them, it looks like basically what they were doing is they were taking their fabric or their leather, soaking it in that glue, and then putting it over the boards when it was still like really, really wet, and there sewing the edges on, just with a loose whip stitch, sewing those edges on. As that dries, it squeezes inwards, so it pulls those boards even closer together, so that the whole shield is a lot more rigid. Once that's done, that's when they're adding the edging. Again, we don't know for sure what they were using for edging, but it was some kind of natural material. It wasn't these big metal rims that we see in a lot of the pictures, a lot of the TV shows. There's not any evidence for that in the Viking period. What we do have evidence of is that it was probably leather or rawhide, which again was soaked in probably room temperature water, certainly not boiling water. We don't see any of the stress cracking or stress shrinkage that you would get with boiling water. So you're looking at just like room temperature water, and again, basically sewn around the edges. Looks to be with probably a saddle stitch or a back stitch of some kind. And once that's sewn around the edging, you've got your basically your glued on covering and this rawhide or leather edging sewn on. Those both together constrict all the boards in so that they are as snugly together as possible. From that point on, we have a couple of different bits of evidence for how things like the handle would be attached. The vast majority of the ones found in graves, they seem to be attached with a few rivet nails. So basically, your square-headed nail, you're going to pound it through from the front of the shield in through the handle, and then you're going to either peen the edge so that you've got that round little flat rivet at the edge, or you're going to fold the edge over and hammer it into the wood so that you've got basically a hook coming over from the backside. There is also a lot of evidence for using this method as well as wood pins, which makes sense to me. We see that in other pieces of woodworking that they're doing at the time, some of the chests, things like that, where basically they're drilling a little hole, they're getting a piece of wood and hammering it in, maybe with a little bit of glue surrounding it. And then once that's nicely set and tight in there, they're just shaving off the edges. So the shields that I've made, I've basically done a combination of both those things, where I'll have a lot of wood pegs to just keep everything really, really solid. And then to make sure that nothing's going to come apart on me if we get one of those days where the weather changes, things get too wet or too dry, just a couple of those riveted nails along. So that's your very basic construction. What we want to get into now is, why did they make their shields that way? When almost everyone else, they were coming into contact with shields that were made in a completely different way at that point in time. Running the gamut from a lot of the early Anglo-Saxon shields were basically wickerwork shields, where they would do a wickerwork shield with a leather or fabric covering over it, up through, much later Anglo-Saxon, throughout Europe, they were using these, these big, heavy-duty hardwood shields. Why were the Vikings using these shields that, for all intents and purposes, look particularly dainty and fragile? But they kept using them throughout the entire Viking period, so they're obviously doing something right. What is it that's good about these shields? So when I started making mine, I set out with the idea that I was going to make this shield and I was going to test it. And in order to be able to give it a faithful test, I wanted to make it using as much period-appropriate stuff as possible. So I started out with getting my log and splitting boards from it. I ended up only having one or two usable boards for the shield, so I put those in places that seemed like they would be getting some pretty prominent hits. The rest, I basically just used some wood that I was able to pick up from Home Depot. And I did all of those methods we just described. I snugged the boards together, I let them glue, I got my linen coverings and stretched it and glued it, I got my rawhide around the edges, all of that stuff. And then I painted it with the most period-appropriate paint I could get my hands on, which was a milk-based paint. And we have documentation for that being available in the Viking period. And my aim was to say, okay, I've used all of my period tools from the get-go, not a single power tool in sight. I mean, right down to when I was drilling the holes, I was using a period T-handle drill, which I made. So basically, I took a terrible old screwdriver that I found in the lawn when I was mowing it. It was just a rusty, terrible old screwdriver, but it seemed to be made out of poor quality tool steel, which is similar to the bog iron that the Vikings were using. And I threw that in my terrible little forge that I made out of an old barbecue, hammered it into shape. You get 2 or 3 different types of T-handle drill. One of the more common ones you can see, it's basically like a trident prong at the edge. You get other ones that are basically just like a flathead screwdriver. So I made all of my drills. I drilled every hole in there by hand. When I was shaving the boards down to get them thin enough and make sure I was doing everything right, just used basically a draw knife that I'd made. Right down to chamfering the edges. Again, I used a terrible old rusty screwdriver that I got for like 45 cents. And again, in the forge, hammered it down and shaped it so that I had this basically little curved blade, and I used that for chamfering all the edges so that I could have the thinner edges and the thicker center. My plan from there was I want to be able to test it out with a real properly sharp-edged live steel weapon. And I don't know of anyone insane enough that they would be willing to hold that shield for me, no matter how much armor they had on, so that I could just attack the shield. So I basically strapped the shield to my bell with a loose strap so that it would pivot as it had blows coming at it. And it would pivot side to side, it would pivot up and down. And the aim for this was, as much as possible, to mimic someone holding the shield, just, you know, in your loose grip, the way you hold your shield when you're fighting, and the movements that they might be making as they're defending themselves. Because let's be honest, if someone's fighting, they are not just going to be standing there completely rigid, holding their shield as tightly as they can in one place, while someone hits it over and over again. And you're not even, when you're making that hit at someone, you're not aiming for the shield. Someone is moving that shield into your weapon to keep your weapon from hitting their nice soft flesh. But I wanted to make it as realistic as possible and see what I could find out from doing this. So my very first shield, it took, I believe, 18 or 19 blows in total before it was no longer usable. And you can see it, without that grip, it seems like it's falling apart. But the only thing that made it get to the point where it was no longer usable was that I was able to get in so many direct shots in one area, because again, this is someone, you know, they're not moving a shield around, that I was able to loosen up the shield boss and get in and break the handle. All of these boards, you could put another handle on here and continue using this shield. This was the thing that really surprised me about using a Viking shield. So what you can see damage-wise is you'll get chunks that will split off like this, and they'll split pretty much lengthwise, but the rest of the board is still solid. You know, there's a tiny little bit of flex in there, but other than that, this thing would be usable if I put a new handle on it. There is so much life left in it. The other thing that I discovered, which to me seems like the reason they were constructing shields in this method, is that almost every single one of those blows, whether it be with my big broad-headed axe, whether it be with a shield, a knife, almost every single one of those blows, my weapon got trapped in the shield. So I would do a really good, you know, the kind of swing with the axe that you're thinking, this is going to split the shield in two, I'm going to look majestic, it's going to be amazing. No, I would hit, and my axe would get stuck in the shield. And it was quite clear to me that in the time it took for me to get that weapon pulled out of the shield and recock ready to hit again, that person has reached over the shield and just stuck a sword right through my face. It's almost ingenious when you're actually physically using one of those shields. Because yeah, they might not stand up the same in certain ways as like a big heavy oak shield, but they have amazing maneuverability. They stand up to a ridiculous amount of stuff. On top of that, they are a solid method for basically stealing the other person's weapon temporarily. So you can see how when they've got these big, wide, circular shields that they're able to pivot in pretty much every direction because of that center grip. That they're able to easily maneuver into wherever your weapon's going. They might not be able to get directly that shield boss onto your weapon, but if they can even get the edge of the shield onto one edge of your weapon, they're at least deflecting it. If not deflecting it, they're trapping your weapon in their shield. And you now have options of either I'm going to reach over and stab you, or if we're in a shield wall and it's really dense fighting and I can't quite reach over, I can do things like yank my shield backwards and pull your weapon out of your hand. Now, eventually, if you've got like 5 different spears sticking in that shield, it's going to get too heavy and unwieldy to use. But it's still giving these advantages that seem to back up why they would be using a shield constructed like this for such a long period of time. So before I go into some more of the details and some of the intricacies of it, does anyone have any questions, anything they're particularly interested in? No, everyone good? Okay.
How did you have the handles attached?
So I might be able to show it a little bit better on this one. Basically, again, just pine wood handles. And in this one, it's entirely done with wood pegs. So basically, I would use that T-handle drill. I would drill a hole from the front of the shield into the handle and then just hammer a little wooden peg in there that I basically just dipped the tip of it in glue before I hammered it in. Once it's hammered in all snug and tight, that thing's not moving. I mean, you can see this has been really split off at the edge here. This was actually Sir Joel after probably 45 minutes of people whacking away at this shield with various weapons ranging from my period appropriate Viking weapons to full-on like fantasy level weird katanas with spikes on them. And finally Joel did, a couple of really good solid blows where the shield boss stayed fine, but he managed to get through by repeatedly hitting the same area and get through and snap this. And you can see, even though the whole section here snapped off, this thing's still totally rigid. It's not going anywhere. And that, again, is part of why that first shield I tested, I really believe that I could put another handle on that and that thing would still be usable for a lot longer. It was just kind of bad luck and bad methodology on my part that I didn't attach the shield boss as well as I could have. So after a number of repeated blows right against the boss, that thing finally loosened enough that I could start aiming directly at where the grip was. And it was breaking the grip that basically rendered the shield no longer usable.
And the boss was just glued and pegged on?
The boss on this one and on the first one I was showing you guys, those were both riveted on. So basically, square head iron nails. And what I did was hammer them through from the front. And then on the first one, I peened the edges. I found that they just came apart too easily if you got a lot of repeated blows. So with the second one, I basically hooked the edges over. So you're taking the edge of that, because the iron-headed nails, long, skinny shanks, basically folded it over into hook and then hammered that so it was hooked into the wood at an angle. And that one, the shield boss, I just finally took it off because I wanted to use it in another shield. Anyone else get any questions they want to ask?
I'll just jump in real quick to let everybody know, if you didn't see it, I put the link to the attendance sheet in the chat. If you'd like credit for your attendance, please fill that out, or give me a holler if you have trouble with it and I can put your name in.
And definitely worthwhile making sure that you get your attendance points, because they're really working hard on rebuilding the Artemisia University. So in all of my testing, what I was really going for was the most realistic scenario that I could possibly do to test out how these shields actually performed. And that first one I did, again, it was terrifying to me that I had spent probably 2 months working on it whenever I wasn't at work, that kind of thing. Making this thing lovingly by hand using period tools where I'd made the tools, and I made it knowing the whole time I am going to destroy this. I got to the point where I had the shield strapped up and I had my axe and I was standing there ready to hit it. And I'm not going to lie, I had to have a shot of whiskey before I started. Because I was just looking at it thinking, I cannot imagine another like arts and sciences project that I've worked on, lovingly crafted, that I was like, and I'm going to smash it up when I'm done. But I really felt like I wasn't going to understand why these shields were made this way, how we were using these shields in period without doing this actual work on it. So with the first one I made, I was like, okay, I can see that being able to do concentrated blows to a particular area over and over again without this shield being properly used in a defensive way, I'm able to destroy it pretty quickly. But I can already see a bunch of benefits that this style of shield would have. So I decided that what I wanted to do from that point was try and make a few more. And once I'd made those few more, find a better way to test them. And I was actually able to use them basically as a fundraiser event at Raptor War last year, where people basically paid to take a blow at the shield. So we had one shield where you could pay, and it was like $2 a blow until the shield falls apart. And then another one where we auctioned it off, and whoever won the shield, they could either destroy it entirely by themselves or they could bring in friends to help them destroy it. And they got the wrecked shield as a keepsake at the end. So I made a couple more shields, and I decided that the best way I could mimic this shield actually being used defensively in a combat scenario without finding someone insane enough to armor up and stand there holding it for me, was I was going to pivot it on, instead of a pell, basically a big metal IV pole. And it was attached so that it could pivot pretty much every direction. But we also had ropes attached to the sides so that I could have someone standing either side who is an experienced fighter who can look at a blow coming in and think about how would I deal with that blow, and they could yank on the rope to pull the shield in roughly the direction that they would have used it if they were using it defensively. And then as an extra thing, we basically made a couple of giant boffer spears. And we had them stand around the general area of where the shield was and just stab and whack at whoever was trying to hit the shield. So that we could mimic, okay, someone is using the shield defensively in a war scenario. You're not going to be standing there one-on-one with no one else attacking either of you while this person holds their shield solidly in one place. So I was trying to come up with as many variables as I could. And what we found was that with those variables, with the shield being moved more defensively rather than being more static, with other people coming in and taking blows at you as you're trying to line up your shot, those shields lasted so much longer. Because again, it was blow after blow the weapon was getting trapped. When you've got other people taking shots at you, you can't line up those blows so that you're hitting that one sweet spot over and over to break the shield as early as possible. We're also finding that when that shield is being moved defensively, when it's getting pivoted around a lot more, so many of those blows, they weren't even getting trapped in the shield, they were just skidding along the surface. And the best I can theorize is that part of that is because the mixture of that period paint and that period appropriate glue, it gives the shield almost this, it's not quite a lacquer, but it's similar to a lacquer gloss. And so unless, you've got a point or an edge really coming directly in at a solid angle, what you're finding is it makes a little scrape and then just slides. And so this provided even more longevity when we were testing it out. It was so much fun to watch people just being like, okay, I will put up the money, here's your pile of weapons to choose from. I'm going to keep paying because I want to try this weapon. I want to try that weapon. I want to try this technique. I want to try that technique. We had, I had my period appropriate Viking spear that I made myself, and we had some big, hefty, solid fighters who know how to thrust a spear, and they were either getting it all the way through to about, halfway up that spearhead, and then it was getting trapped, or they were just barely getting it through the shield, and then they were having to really yank back out. And you can see a really great example of that here. So just here on the shield, I'll get this as close in as I can. You can barely see this on the front. You just see this tiny little gash. It's a little bit easier to see on the back with the yellow paint, but you can see basically the wood's parted, and you've got this tiny little hole here. Now, the interesting part about that, this was a really solid, direct blow. That was as far through as they could get it. And the wood, it didn't splinter. It didn't even split horizontally the way it had been with other boards, because the angle that the spear had come in at, if you imagine we've got the horizontal grain and the spear had come in at this kind of angle. Even coming in at that angle where you don't have basically the wood fibers separating as the weapon comes through and then snapping closed on it again, it still wasn't able to penetrate. And instead of splintering, cracking, fracturing off in different directions, the wood basically pulped in this one tiny little area and then wouldn't go any further. And when I looked at it really closely, you can see that basically the fabric is still solidly glued to the wood around it. So without the stress of that, that fiber line in the wood, you know, kind of being horizontal there, without the stress of it saying, okay, well, it's split here, I'm going to go all the way down this line and the grain of the wood will split further. Without that there, the wood just couldn't separate when it had that fiber, that linen covering glued on there. It could only move so far apart, and then it was just done. It was like it took all the force out of this really solid blow. So again, we're starting to see there is a sense behind these very lightweight shields. The one thing I'm really interested to test in the future is to look at how these shields perform against different styles of weaponry and different combat techniques. Because we know that the Vikings were using this style and that it worked really, really well for them. But it doesn't seem to have continued. It goes for a little while post-Viking age, and then it changes into these different versions that are much more like what the rest of Europe is using. And we don't see the rest of Europe having the Vikings come in, raid them, attack them, win battle after battle, going, you know, there's just something about those shields. We might want to start using a shield in that style. They tend to continue using the shields they've already been using. And I tend to go by the theory that our ancestors were not idiots. In general, if they saw something that was going to work better for them, that was going to benefit them, for the most part, they were willing to adopt that, at least just so they could keep themselves on top. So I believe that there is positives to the other styles of shields being used in the period, and I would really like to do some more testing and find out what are some of the negatives about this style that might have made other cultures unwilling to adopt it. Because in a lot of ways, it seems like this style of shield might have come from the fact that this is the methods and the tools the Vikings had available. It was easier for them than trying to ship in lots of hardwood to make these different styles of shields. So they came up with something with the tools that they had to make this really good, viable shield. That might be why they were not willing to change it, even when they owned these other areas. But there's got to be something in there that we're not seeing quite yet. Anyone have any questions so far? Anything you want to kind of talk about?
I have a question. I'm not familiar with milk-based paint. Could you explain a little bit about what that was?
So I was actually able to pick it up at the local Home Depot, but it's basically a method where instead of using like oil or water as the base for the paint, and a lot of modern paints, they're using some kind of mineral oil or plasticized oil as the base for the paint. They're using basically milk. So when the milk is getting separated out into like curds and whey, that leftover water can be added to. Sometimes they'll use egg, and it basically can be used to form kind of like a glue. And they'll be adding pigments into that glue, and then a couple of other ingredients, usually something like vinegar or water, that's basically going to thin it out, keep it from actually drying into a glue in your container, and then you're able to use that to paint, and then it will dry with almost like a hard gloss.
So it's almost like a egg tempera.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
It's a very similar concept.
And then as a follow-up question, have you ever had people test out mass weapons, hammers, maces, things like that against that shield?
Not yet, mainly because at first we were focusing on weapons that were just like Viking weapons. And then when we were stretching a little bit, it was what weapons people had on hand to bring with them. Hence why we had some ridiculous fantasy weapons, but no one had like a mace or anything like that on hand at the time. But it's something that, again, I'm hoping to test out in future and see what a difference it makes.
I have a question. Did you see very much of a difference between the like commercial milled boards that you used versus the split boards, as how they survived?
I did actually, and it's something that it's noted in the documentation there, but I want to do a little bit more extensive testing. I found that the boards that were split from the log versus the boards that were commercially milled stood up to a lot more. And I've found this in a lot of different projects I've worked on where I've split that wood myself. And my best theory of why is that basically when you're getting a milled board, you're getting something where they've taken the blade and they've cut through and they've said, this is the width that I'm having, all the excess has been manually removed in this fashion. When you're using a board that's been split, basically as you're hammering in those wedges and splitting that trunk apart, what you're left with in your planks is all of those grains, all of those wood fibers that were really tightly held together. They've allowed the weaker ones, the ones that didn't have quite the same solid gripping function, those are the ones that have paired off and let it split apart, and the ones that are left have that really strong bond. So in the testing, I found that those boards held up a lot better. They were able to deflect blows more reliably. When they did split, when a weapon penetrated and they split, they snapped onto the weapon a lot tighter. So it took honestly, it took a phenomenal amount more work to get that weapon removed when it was in one of the rived boards versus one of the milled boards. And it also didn't split as far along the grain. Again, I want to do a lot more testing. Eventually, what I would like to do is make a couple of shields and have them side by side and have one basically entirely modern milled boards, one entirely rived boards that I've split myself, and then basically have someone go and do, okay, I'm going to do this shot on this shield, exact same shot on the other one, shot for shot, see which one survives longer, what differences I can see in each of those blows and then the reaction the wood has to those blows. But there definitely seems to be a strength and flexibility benefit to using the split wood over the milled wood. Anyone have any other questions before I go into some of the more archaeological specifics? Okay, so I've got a couple of options. I'm looking at screen sharing right now, and I keep getting an error message every time I try and do the screen share. So what I'm going to do, for those of you who are interested in looking at some of the actual archaeological images, if you want to go ahead and pull up that documentation PDF that Ursula kindly shared for us.
I'll grab it one more time and throw it in the chat so it's at the bottom.
Okay. So I'm just going to go down. I want to bring up one particular image for you guys. So if you keep scrolling, you're going to get into the appendix where you see how I constructed this first shield. And what I want to show you is, first of all, the peg method for when I was putting on all of my bracers and the grip. So if you're scrolling on the PDF, it should be about page 8. And what you'll see is the boards have been glued together at this point. And then I just have these thin strips of pine that have been glued onto the board. I've drilled through using that T-handle drill, and I've hammered in these small wooden pegs. And I made a point with this. I specifically used the cheapest, most terrible, low-quality wood pegs I could find, apart from 2 of the pegs. So the 2 on the center left that you can see, so the top one you can easily see on the page, and the one below that, those were pegs that I made myself, that I literally just tore a branch off of a tree, shaved it down with my knife, and stuck those in there. And I wanted to see if that made much of a difference versus, again, the milled pegs. And I have to say, honestly, I didn't see a massive difference in that. So I think, methodology-wise, a lot of the strength that we are getting from the milled boards versus the rived boards, which seem to be stronger and more flexible, I think a lot of that is in the amount of width and the amount of grain that's available there to play with. With these tiny little pegs, it really doesn't seem to make a difference. It's all about how tightly those are gripped, not so much like the actual construction method of the pegs themselves. From there, I want to just scroll down, and we're going to go to page 11. And this is where you can see the paint happening. So you can see I did a base paint of yellow, and then red on top of that, and then one more yellow to give my shield design. And you can see the sort of gloopy, glossy sheen on that. A lot of us were used to, when we see shields in the SCA context, you're seeing these ones that are painted with spray paint or acrylic paints, and you get this really beautiful fine finish. I feel like the big mistake that I made on this was that I had already used this glue, which is a glue that's based on being heated in order to be moldable. I'd glued on the fabric, and then the milk paint, in order to basically get it a little bit closer to what the period paints seem to have been based on the archaeological finds we have, I mixed in some hot pine resin with it. And so we ended up with this paint that was already pretty hot as I was painting it on. And you can see where it sort of wrinkled and come away from the boards there. And I really believe that that's basically, I've heated up the glue. And so as I'm moving the brush along there, painting that shield, the glue's loosened up, the fabric's starting to come away from it. But it doesn't seem to have made an impact on how the shield's performed. And if you look at the picture below, I mean, you can still see there's those wrinkles in the fabric now, whereas beforehand it was really smooth and solidly bonded on there. But it still has this very thick looking, not quite glossy, but almost varnished texture. You can see that paint has really provided an extra almost layer of solid covering to these boards. And I am very interested in using some different pigments and some different methods of laying those pigments on to see how much of a difference that makes, especially with things like the blows that are skipping across the shield rather than sinking into the wood where it's more stationary. And so I just kind of wanted to bring attention to that, because at this point I can't solidly say how much of the pigments and covering that I used changes the way the shield performs. And so that definitely bears a lot more experimentation on there. Anyone have any questions from this point? Okay. Well, the one last thing that I wanted to go over was just a little bit as far as the archaeological finds. Now, we don't have a ton of Viking shields in the archaeological record. And a lot of what we do have, it's parts of the shield. We've got maybe most of the planks of wood have survived. And we can see we've got the planks of wood and we've got the grip and the shield boss. But anything that was covering the shield has rotted away. Anything that was on the edges of the shield has rotted away. We have a lot of finds where we have the shield boss and part of the grip, and just tiny little pieces of wood around the edge of the shield boss, where the shield boss has rusted and covered those pieces of wood, and the entirety of the rest of the shield has rotted away. The best preserved shields that we have are from the Gokstad ship burial. And that particular burial, from an archaeological standpoint, it's really in a prime place to get as much survivability as possible for some of these artifacts. On a microstratigraphic level, it's in this harbour bay where you've got just the right mixture of clay and sand and oxygen deprivation, but not too many microbes. The temperature's just right so that you can have things like wood surviving a lot more easily. And so we actually have a number of shields appear to be purely for display. They were all, attached along the side of the ship before the burial, a couple inside, but they really don't seem to have been shields that were ever intended to be used. The wood is not nearly as even as in the shields that we found that were actually used in battle. They are significantly bigger, by a few inches diameter, than most of the shields we found that seem to be functional shields. And they don't have any covering on them. The paint was just directly onto the wood itself. And from everything we have been able to find and test, it really looks like these shields were for display only, but they were still put together up to a certain point using the same methodologies. And so we're able to say, yeah, this is people that were used to making shields. They just decided to make a few that, were just going to be used for display for this particular funeral. And so we're not going to go to all of these extra lengths. We're going to do the basics we need to do to construct them and then paint them and put them up there to look good. Some of the other finds that we've had do have one particular thing on them that has led to something we see a lot in the reenactment community, which is these Viking shields with lots of little metal, almost like metal C-shaped clamps nailed around the edges. Now, certainly the stuff that we have way post-Viking period, where it talks about having metal edging on your shield, we know from the archaeological record that was not happening in the Viking period. But a lot of people see these particular finds and they will argue that the reason for that was that they couldn't afford the full metal rim, so they were just doing lots of random little pieces of metal around the rim so that they could still show off how rich and fancy they were and have that extra level of protection. From a theoretical testing standpoint, having lots of little pieces of metal nailed around the edge of your shield, you're just weakening the edge of those boards. It's not going to give you any more protection if someone's axe comes into that piece of metal, because you're basically going to have that concussive force that's going to go through the metal into the rivet and then just crumble the wood at that point. So now you're just going to have a piece of metal that's half falling off the edge of your shield. What seems to be much more likely, and that we can document this same method being used in other places other than those particular burial mounds, in other areas of the Viking world, is that they were repairing a board. We can see in a lot of woodworking that's been found in the Viking period, basically taking little pieces of brass, sometimes little pieces of iron, where you've got some, pieces of wood that are coming apart that have had a chunk come out of them for some reason, that the glue's coming apart, that the wood's been damaged, where they'll basically take this little piece of metal and then rivet it either side, and you're putting a metal band-aid on that piece of wood that's been damaged. The vast majority of the Viking shields found with these little pieces of metal edging, they're not beautifully evenly spaced all around the edge to be, wonderful and decorative. It's random pieces here and there. And it really seems to me, and most archaeologists agree with this idea, and I guess I agree with their theory on this, it seems most likely that they are there as a repair method. So what we're seeing here is people that are using shields more than once. They're taking these shields into a battle, and they're coming out afterwards with the shields still usable. They just need to do a couple of minor repairs. So I think that's something interesting to think about, and definitely something to kind of test as you know, most of us who are into the idea of experimenting with this stuff, as we get to experiment with more methods, more testing proponents, we can start thinking about, okay, well, I've got a shield that it's mostly still functional. I'm going to use this repair method on the edge and see what difficult, you know, problems I have with it. Do I see any differences when I actually use the shield? So I think from the standpoint of being able to say, we know how the shields were constructed in period versus what we're taught about how they were constructed by later sagas and things, now we can start looking into some of those finer details. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'd really like to open up. Does anyone have any questions, anything they would kind of like to know more about? No? Okay.
Pretty well covered it.
I am always open to more questions. I know for a fact myself when I'm in classes, I often think of a question about 10 minutes after I leave. Please feel free to get in touch with me afterwards. I am happy to kind of email back and forth with you and let you get all the information you need. Thanks you guys for coming. Make sure you get all your credits for the class, and I will let you guys go and give you a few minutes before the next class you hit.
Again, don't forget to sign the attendance sheet if you'd like credit through Artemisia University. And thank you so much, Angus. The other good place that it might be helpful to go for discussion is the Artemisia Kingdom Discord. There's a lot of good, there's a classroom hangouts channel in there that kind of where people have been chatting about some of the classes. So feel free to jump over there too. And we'll get this shared ASAP.
Right. Thanks.
Everybody.
You're welcome. You guys take care. Enjoy.